The little girl was lying face down on the kitchen floor when I walked through the back door of my daughter's house without knocking. Her shoes were still on. One arm was tucked beneath her body and the other stretched toward the table leg as though she had reached for something before she fell. My granddaughter Emma was 8 years old, and for 3 terrible seconds I could not tell whether she was breathing. Then I heard the man standing 6 feet away set his coffee mug on the counter and say, "She is fine, Thomas. She just got dizzy after running around the yard." I looked at him. I looked at the child on the floor, and something inside me became perfectly still because I had spent 26 years learning to recognize the difference between a man who was concerned and a man who was managing a scene. But to understand how I ended up standing in that kitchen staring at a man I had tried for 2 years to trust while my granddaughter lay motionless on cold tile, I need to take you back to the beginning. None of us saw what was coming. Least of all me, and I should have, because reading people had once been my entire life. My name is Thomas Bellamy. I was 67 years old and living alone in a small house at the end of Orchard Lane in Coopersville, Tennessee. Population, just under 4,000 if you count the dogs and the 3 cats that belonged to nobody but showed up at every porch expecting breakfast. I drove a 1991 Ford pickup that needed a new alternator every spring and a prayer every winter. I had a chocolate Labrador named Herschel who followed me everywhere, including the bathroom, because he believed loyalty meant never letting a man sit alone regardless of the circumstances. Every morning at 6:15, I walked into Miller's Diner and sat at the same corner booth beneath a mounted bass that had been hanging on the wall since before I moved to town. I ordered 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, and a side of grits because my wife Margaret always said grits made a man reasonable before noon, and I had never found a reason to argue with her about it. I spent my afternoons fixing screen doors for the widows down Maple Street, sharpening mower blades in my garage, and replacing the porch light at the church because Pastor Daniels kept buying the wrong bulb size, and I did not have the heart to tell him. People in Coopersville knew me as the quiet man who showed up when something needed repairing and left before anyone could make a fuss. That was exactly how I preferred things. What nobody in that town knew, and what I never volunteered, was that before I retired to fix screen doors and feed a Labrador, I had spent 26 years as a senior criminal investigator for the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. I had built cases against officers who believed rank made them untouchable. I had sat across tables from men who lied with absolute confidence and watched that confidence dissolve sentence by sentence under the weight of evidence they never knew I had been assembling. When I retired, I did so without ceremony. I packed 1 box, drove home to Margaret, and she made me a ham sandwich and said, "Welcome back, Thomas. Now please fix the screen door. It has been broken for 6 months. I never spoke about my career again." Margaret knew everything. That was enough. Margaret, my wife of 41 years. She died on a Tuesday in November, the kind of cold gray morning when the sky looks like wet concrete and the world feels like it is holding its breath. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 8 months. She lasted 14 because she informed me and the oncologist and God himself that she was not leaving until the garden was mulched for winter and the Christmas lights were tested, because she refused to have me electrocute myself in December without her there to supervise. That was Margaret. Stubborn in ways that made the universe adjust its schedule around her. She had a way of saying things that sounded simple until you sat with them long enough to realize they were the wisest words you had ever heard. Her favorite was one she repeated so often that I could hear it in her voice years after she was gone. "The truth does not need volume, Thomas. It only needs time." She said it when I came home angry about a case. She said it when I wanted to argue with a neighbor at midnight over a vandalized mailbox. She said it the last morning she was strong enough to squeeze my hand before the morphine carried her somewhere I could not follow. After Margaret passed, the house became a museum of silence. I made coffee for 2 every morning for 11 months before I stopped reaching for her mug. I talked to her rocking chair. I told Herschel stories about her, and he listened with the serious expression of a dog who understood that grief required an audience, even if that audience had 4 legs and smelled like pond water. Some nights I sat on the back porch watching fireflies drift across the yard like tiny lanterns released by ghosts, and I told the darkness what I should have said more often when she was sitting beside me: grief does not leave. I learned that. It simply learns over time to walk beside you quietly enough that you can carry it without falling. The reason I kept waking up was my daughter Grace. She was 34, a second-grade teacher at Ridgewood Elementary, about 40 minutes east of Coopersville. She had her mother's patience, her mother's quiet laugh, and her mother's stubborn belief that people deserve chances even when the evidence suggested otherwise. She had given me a granddaughter named Emma, who was 8 years old and had more personality in her small body than most adults carry in a lifetime. Emma called me Pop and believed I could fix anything in the known universe, including the weather. Grace had married a man named Richard Calloway 3 years earlier. Richard was 39, tall, athletic, the kind of man who wore a pressed sport coat to a backyard barbecue and made everyone else feel underdressed without saying a word about their clothes. He worked in pharmaceutical sales and made considerably more money than anyone in our family had ever seen. He drove a black sedan that probably cost more than my house and truck combined. He spoke in smooth, measured sentences that always sounded slightly rehearsed, as though he had practiced them in front of a mirror before delivering them to real people. I tried hard to like him. For Grace's sake and for Emma's sake, I wanted Richard to be the man he presented to the world. Margaret would have seen through him in 30 seconds flat. She had a gift for reading people the way mechanics read engines, by listening for the sound that does not belong. It took me considerably longer because I was doing something investigators should never do. I was hoping the evidence would match the story I wanted to believe instead of the story the evidence was actually telling. The first sign appeared at Thanksgiving dinner 14 months before I found Emma on that kitchen floor. Richard was carving the turkey, telling a story about a pharmaceutical conference in Chicago. Grace reached across the table to pass the gravy and accidentally knocked his water glass with her elbow. The glass did not break, it barely tipped. A tablespoon of water touched the edge of his placemat, but Richard stopped mid-sentence and turned toward Grace with an expression that sent something cold through my chest. The smile stayed on his face, but his eyes changed. They became flat and hard like two coins pressed into wet clay. He said, "Careful, Grace," in a voice so quiet that everyone at the table heard the silence surrounding the words more clearly than the words themselves. Grace apologized. She apologized 3 times in 8 seconds. I counted because counting is what I trained myself to do. Emma stared at her plate and stopped chewing. Her fork went still in her hand. I watched the entire exchange without saying a word. That night I lay awake replaying the way my daughter had flinched at a tone of voice that most people at that table probably did not register. But I registered it. I had heard that exact tone in interview rooms. The sound of a man who controlled his environment so completely that a whisper carried more threat than a shout. The second sign came at Christmas. Richard insisted we gather at his house because it had better entertaining space. He gave me a tour and paused at his home office door. "This is where the real work happens, Thomas," he said with a smile, designed to remind me that my version of work involved a toolbox and a pickup truck. I let it pass. Margaret would have wanted me to let it pass. During dinner, Richard mentioned Grace had overcooked the roast. He framed it as humor. Everyone laughed. Grace laughed loudest, but her laugh arrived a fraction too late and carried a pitch I recognized from decades of listening to people perform emotions they did not feel. After the meal, Emma followed me to the porch. The air smelled like pine and cold stone. She stood beside me, watching her breath turn to vapor, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Pop, do you think some people act different when nobody is watching?" I looked down at her. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She shrugged with one shoulder the way children do when they are testing whether it is safe to say something important. Just wondering. She was 7 at the time. 7-year-olds do not ask abstract questions about human behavior unless they have watched someone become a different person when the audience changes. If this story is already making you feel something, I hope you will stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so stories like this keep reaching people who need them. The third sign arrived in February. I stopped by Grace's school to bring her lunch. She was outside supervising recess. When she turned toward me, I noticed a bruise along her left forearm, partially hidden beneath her sleeve. The color was that shade of greenish yellow that means 5 to 7 days old. She caught me looking and pulled the fabric down quickly. "I bumped into the cabinet," she said, and the words came out so fast I knew she had rehearsed them. I had heard that sentence dozens of times across my career, from military spouses on base housing, from women in interview rooms with their hands folded and eyes lowered. It always meant the same thing. The cabinet did not do that. Someone did. Later that week, I visited the house unannounced. Richard opened the door, and for 1 second, something flickered across his face before the charm reassembled itself. "Grace is running errands," he said. I told him I would wait. While he talked about the market and a promotion I observed, Emma had not come downstairs even though my truck was visible from her window, and she always ran to greet me. Her bedroom door had a sliding bolt lock installed on the outside, not the inside, the outside. A lock that could only be secured from the hallway. The medicine cabinet in the bathroom had a small combination padlock on it. When Richard excused himself for a phone call, I stood in the hallway and felt the old familiar weight settle onto my shoulders. The weight I used to feel at the beginning of a case when the evidence was still scattered, but the instinct was already certain. Something in this house was wrong. The fourth sign came in March. Grace called on a Sunday evening. Her voice was thin and careful in a way that made me sit up and reach for the notepad on my side table. She said Emma had been feeling unwell. What kind of unwell? Sleepy, she said. Really, really sleepy. She slept through dinner, and I could not wake her for almost 2 hours. Has she seen a doctor? Richard says she is just fighting a bug. He gave her some medicine for it. What medicine? Grace paused. I could hear her breathing through the phone. I am not sure. He handles all her medications because he says he understands dosing better since he works in pharmaceuticals. Something inside me became perfectly still, the kind of stillness that used to come right before I opened a case file that would change everything. That night after hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Herschel lay at my feet watching me with his head on his paws. I could hear Margaret's voice as clearly as if she were sitting across from me. The truth does not need volume, Thomas. It only needs time. The fifth sign was the one that changed everything. It was a Friday in April. Grace asked me to pick Emma up from school. Richard was supposedly traveling for a conference in Atlanta. Emma climbed into my truck, buckled her seatbelt, and sat without speaking. After 2 full minutes of silence, she said, "Pop, can I tell you something?" "Anything, sweetheart." She stared through the windshield at the parking lot. "Sometimes when Mama is not home, Richard gives me a drink before bed." "What kind of drink?" "Sometimes pink, sometimes clear. It tastes like medicine, but Richard says it is vitamins because I do not eat enough vegetables." Then I fall asleep really, really fast. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until I could feel the leather ridges pressing into my palms. What happens after you fall asleep? I do not know. I just wake up and it is morning. Sometimes I feel dizzy when I wake up. "Does Mama know?" Emma shook her head slowly. "Richard says Mama would worry over nothing and I should not upset her because she already has enough stress. He says it is our little routine." My vision blurred. I pulled to the shoulder and stopped the engine. The only sound was a mockingbird in the tree above us and the tick of the cooling engine block. Emma looked at me with an expression I will never forget as long as I live. The face of a child who believes she might have done something wrong by telling the truth. "Did I mess up, Pop?" she whispered. "No, sweetheart." I reached over and took her hand. "You did exactly the right thing. You did exactly the right thing telling me. I drove to my house." I made Emma a peanut butter sandwich and sat her on the couch with Herschel and a documentary about sea otters because she had decided they were the funniest animals alive. Then I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and pressed both hands flat against the wall because something inside me was shaking so hard I was afraid if I did not hold on to something solid, I would drive to Richard's house and do something that would put me in prison and leave my granddaughter without the one person she had just trusted with the most frightening secret of her life. I did not call Grace immediately. I did not call the police. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table after Emma fell asleep and opened the legal pad where I had been keeping my notes. I wrote the date. I wrote Emma's exact words without changing a single one. Then I turned back through the pages and began connecting what she told me to every observation over the previous 16 months. The locked bedroom door, the padlock cabinet, Grace's comment about sleeping through dinner, Richard handling all medications, the bruise, the flinch at Thanksgiving, Emma asking whether some people act differently when nobody watches. It was all one thing. It had always been one thing. I poured coffee and began building the case the way I had built every case for 26 years. Not with anger, with evidence, with documentation, with the patience Margaret always told me the truth required. Before I continue, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from right now. I read every single one, and knowing you are out there keeps these stories alive. Over the following 2 weeks, I became the investigator I'd been for half my adult life. I requested Emma's complete medical history through the insurance portal Grace had access to. I sat at my kitchen table with reading glasses and a highlighter and went through every claim from the previous 24 months. What I found made me set down the highlighter and stare at the wall. There were 6 medical claims involving Emma that Grace had never mentioned. Each one occurred when Richard was the sole caregiver while Grace was at school conferences or overnight events. Each claim involved symptoms described as drowsiness, altered consciousness, or lethargy in a minor. The medications listed were over-the-counter antihistamines, diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in common sleep aids. I contacted each clinic. 3 of the 4 confirmed the responsible adult present was Richard Calloway. He had taken Emma to 4 different walk-in clinics across 3 towns, never once to her pediatrician, never to the same facility twice. No single provider saw the pattern because he made sure no single provider had enough visits to recognize one. But patterns were my profession. My entire career had been built on finding them before the people creating them realized they existed. I called an old colleague named Martin who still worked in criminal investigation consulting. I told him everything without names. He went quiet for a long time. "Thomas," he said, "that is consistent with deliberate chemical sedation of a minor. I know. You need law enforcement and child protective services. I know. Then why are you calling me? Because I have one chance to present this correctly and I need the evidence organized so it cannot be dismissed as a grandfather's paranoid theory." Martin helped me build the case over the next 10 days. Medical claims with dates, insurance records, my documented observations, Emma's words with time and context, Richard's pattern of rotating facilities, Grace's verified absences during each incident, the exterior lock on Emma's bedroom door, the padlocked medicine cabinet. When we finished, I had 41 pages of evidence that told a story no amount of charm could talk its way past. On a Saturday morning, I drove to Grace's house. Richard was at a conference in Charlotte. Grace opened the door and I could see how tired she was. Shadows beneath her eyes that had not been there a year ago. I sat her at the kitchen table. The house smelled like coffee and the lilac candle she kept on the windowsill. I placed the folder in front of her. I told her everything. I did not editorialize. I did not raise my voice. I walked her through the evidence the way I had walked prosecutors through evidence hundreds of times. The medical records, Emma's exact words, the timeline matched against Grace's own absences, the rotating clinics, the medication names. Grace did not speak for 15 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall behind her the way I used to watch the clock during long interviews when silence itself was evidence of something breaking open inside a person. When she finally looked up, her face had changed. The woman across from me was no longer trying to protect her marriage. She was trying to understand how this had been happening while she graded spelling tests in the next room. "Dad, what do I do?" she whispered. I took both of her hands. "We do this the right way." We called Jennifer Alderman, a family attorney who specialized in child protection and high-conflict custody cases. Jennifer reviewed the file that afternoon at Grace's kitchen table, reading every page without interruption. She spent the longest time on the timeline, matching Richard's sole caregiver periods to the medical claims. "Mr. Bellamy," she said, "this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases I have seen from a family member. Most of the time we reconstruct this kind of timeline after the fact. You have already done the work that usually takes investigators months." By Sunday evening, she had filed for an emergency protective order. Monday morning, a judge reviewed the medical evidence, Emma's documented statements, the clinic pattern, and the timeline, and signed the order. Richard was prohibited from contacting Emma directly or indirectly, prohibited from the family residence, prohibited from accessing her records, effective immediately. Richard found out Tuesday. He was in Charlotte when Jennifer's office contacted his attorney. He called Grace 11 times. She did not answer. He called me once. "Thomas, what have you done?" His voice had lost every trace of the polish I had heard at Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas gatherings. "You know exactly what I did, Richard. This is a misunderstanding. She takes children's vitamins. Then you should have no difficulty explaining that to investigators. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to hear a car door close in his background. When he finally spoke, his voice was afraid. You had no right. I leaned forward in my chair. Richard, I said slowly, I had every right. She is my granddaughter. I ended the call and set the phone on the porch railing. Herschel looked up at me. Margaret would have been proud of me for not saying the other things I wanted to say. She always believed the truth spoke loudest when you gave it room and stepped back. Thursday, Richard walked into a meeting at the county courthouse, believing he could negotiate his way through the situation. Jennifer was there. Joyce Palmer from Child Protective Services was there. Detective Harris from the sheriff's office was there. A paramedic named David Chen, who had responded to one of the undocumented incidents 9 months earlier, waited in the hallway ready to be called as a witness. Richard sat down and immediately began explaining that Emma was a high-energy child who occasionally got into medications on her own. He smiled. He used his conference voice. He referenced his pharmaceutical expertise, his income, his community standing. Then Jennifer placed the timeline in front of him. 6 claims, 4 clinics, 3 towns, 6 dates when Grace was verifiably away, the same class of medication every time. Richard's smile disappeared one muscle at a time, like watching a mask develop cracks too numerous to hold together. His attorney requested a recess. During the break, Joyce told me later, Richard stood alone by the window, staring at the parking lot without moving for 4 minutes. When they reconvened, Richard said almost nothing. His attorney did the talking. But the evidence had already spoken in the language I spent my entire career teaching it to use. Facts, dates, records, patterns, a child's own words. The protective order was extended. Criminal charges for endangering a child were filed the following week. I was not in the room when it happened. I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot with Herschel watching a cardinal on the fence post near the entrance. I did not need to be inside. That was what Margaret always understood better than I did. The truth does not need volume. It only needs time. When Grace called and said, "Dad, it is over," I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 months. The weeks that followed were not easy. Grace filed for divorce. She moved with Emma into a small apartment above a bakery on Main Street in Coopersville, 6 minutes from my house. Every morning the place smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread rising, and Emma told me it was the best alarm clock in the world. Emma began seeing a child therapist named Dr. Sullivan, who specialized in helping children process experiences they did not yet have the language to fully describe. Some weeks were good. Emma would run across my yard and tackle Herschel and laugh until her face turned red. Some weeks were harder. She would sit quietly at my kitchen table and suddenly ask Grace whether she would ever have to take the sleepy drink again. Those nights, Grace called me after Emma fell asleep and cried. I drove over every time. I sat with my daughter in her small kitchen and held her hands and told her what Margaret would have said. You did not fail, Emma. You trusted someone who made trusting him feel like the responsible thing to do. The moment you learned the truth, you acted. That is not failure. That is courage arriving when it was needed. I started joining the Saturday morning breakfast group at Miller's Diner. 6 retired men who argued about baseball and fishing and whether the new traffic light on Route 9 was necessary. I had avoided groups since Margaret died. Being alone had felt safer. But sitting beside those men eating biscuits and gravy and listening to Harold Banks complain about his left knee for the 9th consecutive Saturday, I realized something Margaret had tried to tell me. Isolation is not the same thing as strength. Solitude protects you from being seen, but it also prevents anyone from knowing you well enough to help when you need it. One Sunday afternoon, Em and I sat on my back porch watching Herschel chase a squirrel he would absolutely never catch. She was drawing in a spiral notebook with colored pencils. She held up the picture. 2 people in front of a small house with an enormous yellow sun above it and a brown dog in the yard. That is us, Pop, she said. Where is Richard? I asked before I could stop myself. She looked down at the page for a moment. He does not go in pictures anymore. I looked away toward the tree line because my eyes were doing something I did not want her to see. 8 years old, and she had already learned to erase someone from her world because the world felt safer without him in it. Months passed. Grace enrolled in a graduate program for reading specialists. Emma made the honor roll and brought home a certificate that Grace taped to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a ladybug. I rebuilt the back steps of Grace's apartment because the landlord kept promising and never delivered. One evening while I was sanding the rail, Emma brought me a glass of lemonade and stood watching with her arms crossed in a posture so much like Margaret that my chest physically ached. "Pop," she said, "do you think Mama's going to be okay?" I set down the sandpaper and sat beside her on the step. "Your mama is one of the strongest people I have ever known." And I have known some very strong people. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a judge evaluating a legal brief. "Stronger than you." I laughed for the first time in a long time. "Much stronger than me, sweetheart." She smiled. That is what Grandma Margaret would say. My throat tightened. You remember Grandma Margaret. Emma nodded. "Mama tells me things she used to say." "Like what?" "Like the truth does not need to be loud. It just needs to wait." I stared at my granddaughter sitting beside me in the fading light with lemonade on her chin and Margaret's wisdom in her mouth. My wife had been gone for years, but through Grace and now through Emma, her words were still finding the people who needed them at the exact moment they needed to hear them. The dead do not disappear. They become the quiet current beneath everything the living build. That Christmas, Grace and Emma and I sat around my kitchen table eating fried chicken because none of us could cook a turkey and we had agreed to stop pretending. Emma wore a paper crown made from construction paper and aluminum foil. Grace wore the earrings Margaret had left her. Herschel lay under the table with his head on my foot waiting for someone to drop something. It was the smallest Christmas I had ever had. 3 people, a dog and a bucket of fried chicken in a kitchen that still smelled faintly like Margaret's cinnamon candles. It was also the best because everyone at that table was safe, everyone was telling the truth, and nobody was afraid of the person sitting next to them. When I was young, I believed strength meant standing between danger and the people you love with your fists clenched and your jaw set and daring the world to come through you. War taught me something different. It taught me that strength sometimes means knowing when not to move, when to watch, when to document instead of react, when to let silence do the work that shouting never could. And aging finally showed me the truth that matters most of all. Real strength is not measured by what you are capable of doing when the world is watching. It is measured by who you remain when nobody is paying attention. It is the quiet choices made in empty rooms, the steady patience of building a case with evidence instead of anger, the willingness to trust that the truth will do what confrontation never could if you simply give it enough time and enough room to speak. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone who loved you quietly without ever asking for recognition or credit, please share it with them. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And leave a comment telling me what moment hit you the hardest. Sometimes the people who need these words the most find them through you. That is how the truth works. It does not need volume. It only needs one person willing to pass it along.